Before we start, I would encourage you to have a set of the sermon notes. If you don't already have them, just go to the link below. You'll be able to print a set of the sermon notes from that link. Also want to encourage you to have some communion elements. You want to have some bread or a cracker. You want to have some juice or wine. If you don't have juice or wine, probably anything to drink would work. But you'll want to have those communion elements because here in about 20 minutes, when we get to the end of this sermon, we'll move right into a time of communion. So if you need any of those things, I would encourage you to pause the video right now. Get whatever you need. Once everything is ready, then go ahead and resume the playback. So have you ever wondered where preachers get the inspiration for their sermons? Are any of you thinking to yourself right now, wow, Pastor Kerry, there is literally nothing more boring that I can possibly imagine than where preachers get the inspiration for their sermons. No, I've never thought about that before. That seems like the lamest thing that you could possibly talk about. And you're about to talk about it right now, aren't you, Pastor Kerry? Can I change the channel? Well, I hear you, but I think, at least to me, because I am a preacher, the topic of where preachers find the inspiration for their sermons is rather interesting because I am in the business where I have to come up with a new sermon every single week. Literally 52 weeks a year, maybe not quite that often because obviously there's a Sunday or two that I might get to take off for vacation. On the other hand, I have to preach additional sermons outside of those 52 Sunday mornings every year. So by the time all is said and done, I actually need to come up with the inspiration for probably well more than 52 sermons every single year. And I want to share an insight with you, maybe not about necessarily where I come up for the inspiration for my sermons, but for one of the absolute best preachers that I know. This past weekend was actually one of the very rare weekends where I did not preach at Southview. Instead, an old friend of mine, Pastor John Lacey, gave the sermon here at Southview this past weekend. And it's interesting because he shared with me several months ago the inspiration that he had for this sermon that he gave this past Sunday. So maybe that is somewhat reassuring to you just to know that preachers aren't making it up the day before, that in the case of Pastor John, he had come up with the inspiration for this sermon at least 8 weeks in advance. So here was a text that he sent to me. This was way back in February. He said, I woke up at 4:30 the other morning. So apparently Pastor John was not able to sleep. And he said, I saw this meme and the sermon idea came to me immediately. And this was for this past Sunday, May 3rd. And he sent me a meme, and I'm not going to try to show it to you right now, but I'm going to try to describe it for you. It's a meme that shows the side of a coffee cup. And the wording on the meme says, it's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. It's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. And in the picture that accompanies that text, it shows the coffee cup where the handle comes into the cup, the shadow that it creates then on the other side creates a heart. It's a neat effect, whoever took the photo, but what it shows you at first glance appears to be the simple side of a coffee cup, but then you look a little more closely and what you see is a heart. Accompanied by the text, it's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. And that inspired Pastor John to then preach on the passage from the book of Mark where Jesus goes and heals a man. And it's an interesting passage in which the healing has to take place in two parts. Because after Jesus lays his hands on the man the first time, he says, what do you see? And the man responds, well, I see people, but they look like trees. And Jesus says, okay, well, let's try it a second time. And then he lays hands on the man a second time, and then the man's vision is fully restored. It's not what you look at, it's what you see. And when John texted me originally about that and told me about the meme, sent me the meme, and then said that was going to be the inspiration for his sermon, I texted him back and I said, that sounds beautiful, my friend. And then his response was, "Thanks, Carrie. I think that'll preach." And that is a phrase that preachers often use with each other. We might not always use that phrase with everyday people in our lives, because everyday people don't know what it's like necessarily to have to come up with a sermon 52 times a year and a sermon topic 52 times a year, and sermon illustrations and such. But that's a phrase that we use with each other. We will say to each other, "Hey, that'll preach." In this case, it was a meme that Pastor John saw that he said, "That'll preach." And the reason that I have bored you to tears for the past 5 minutes is because in the passage we're about to take a look at, you and I are about to get an insight to the Apostle Paul, where he was out exploring in Athens and he came across something and he saw it and he said, "Hey, that'll preach." The lectionary New Testament reading for May the 10th of 2026 is Acts chapter 17, verses 22 through 31. This is a fairly well-known passage, but I'm not sure you are necessarily familiar with it. So let's go ahead and take a look. Starting with Acts chapter 17, verse 22. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands, and he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. And, as some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead." May God bless the reading of the fascinating and the inspiring word. So this is, like I said, is a passage with which you might be familiar, maybe not, but it is a passage that I know that was looked at very closly by my schoolmates and I when I was going to Bible college. This is a passage that has inspired a lot of people, in part because you get to see the inner workings of a preacher. Probably why it resonated with me and my fellow Bible college nerds several decades ago when I was going to Dallas Christian College. So first, let's do what we always do. Let's talk through the passage. I want to try to explain a number of the interesting aspects of this passage. Again, maybe this is a passage that's only interesting to me as a Bible nerd, but I hope that I can get you at least a little bit more interested in this passage. After we talk through this passage, then we will quickly focus on 3 of the reminders that this passage has for us as Jesus' modern day disciples. So first of all, this is the Apostle Paul. We are well into the book of Acts at this point. We're more than halfway in, and Paul is gone on one of his missionary missions. In this case, he is in Greece. He is in Athens. And he has gone to a meeting of the Areopagus. The Areopagus were the great philosophers, and they were the religious experts for the city of Athens, for Greece. And so Paul is making his case to the people who are interested in different religions and different philosophies. And he, as he was exploring the city of Athens, he found something and he said, "Hey, that'll preach." He said he was walking around looking at their objects of worship. And we know, of course, that most of the Greek people 2,000 years ago, that they did not worship the one true God. We know that they worshipped the Greek gods. They worshipped Zeus and Hermes, and you name it. They worshipped all of the Greek gods. And so as Paul was going around Athens, and he was seeing all of these temples, all of these altars that were set up to all of these Greek gods, he came across one altar that simply said, "To an unknown God." Like, they're trying to hedge their bets, they're trying to cover their bases, and so they've got this altar that's set up to an unknown God. And Paul said to himself in that moment, hey, that'll preach. And so he goes to them and he says, I notice you got this altar set up to an unknown God. Let me tell you about that unknown God. And then he goes on to talk about the one true God. Talks about how God made everything. Doesn't live in temples built by human hands. And so Paul is kind of saying, hey, this whole system you got set up here with all of your altars and all of your temples, says you're doing it all wrong. And he says that this God is not served by human hands. This God doesn't need anything from us. Instead, this is the God who gave us everything that we have. He also talks about how this one God made all the nations from one man. Now, Paul might have been talking about Adam, but he also might have been talking about Abraham. It's not really clear, and I don't think that there's either interpretation that is right or wrong. Adam was obviously the first man, but then Abraham was the one that that God called on and said, look, this is my covenant with you. You're going to be the father of all nations. And so then he goes on to say that this is the God who allowed all things to come into place. This God is never far from you or from me, never far from any of us. And then Paul does something else that's very clever. In this preacher's opinion, he's already done something very clever by saying, hey, that altar that you've got set up to an unknown God, I'm going to tell you about that unknown God. Pretty clever on Paul's part. But then he does something even more clever here in verse 28. For notice that it's in quotes here. In him we move and live and have our being. And as some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. What Paul is doing now is he's quoting Greek philosophers. He's quoting Greek poets and saying, I agree with what this poet said. I agree with what this philosopher said. In him we live and move and have our being. Well, that's talking about the one true God. Whether you realize it or not, whether the person who originally said this or not realized it, they're talking about the one true God. We are his offspring. Again, that's talking about the one true God, whether the poet realized it or not. And so then Paul concludes his sermon to the Areopagus, to the Greek religious and philosophical elites, and he says, we should not think that God is like silver or gold or stone, not an image made by human hands. He says, now it's time for us to repent of any past ignorance, because the day of judgment is going to come. And he concludes by saying that God has given us one man. And now he's not talking about Adam, he's not talking about Abraham. Now you and I know that when Paul refers to the man that God has appointed, he's talking, of course, about Jesus. And says that God has given proof of this to everyone by raising him, Jesus, from the dead. Now, that is where the lectionary passage ends. But what I can tell you is that immediately after this, if you're wondering, how did the Greek religious and philosophical and cultural elites, how did they respond to Paul's sermon? Well, the fact is some of them just kind of laughed at Paul. There were some who said, interesting, we'd like to hear more from you. And the passage immediately after this also tells us that there were at least a couple of the people that were present that day who became Christians as a result of Paul's sermon here in Acts chapter 17. So what do we do with this? Well, obviously, what I'm guessing is that you're probably not going to go and become a preacher and start giving sermons 52 weeks a year. And so let's talk about the more practical applications that this passage has for you and for me and for all of Jesus' modern day disciples. The first reminder I think this passage has for us is this. As disciples, we should know who we're worshiping. As disciples, we should know who we're worshiping. Now, I realize that at first glance you're probably saying to yourself, well, duh, Pastor Kerry, we know who we're worshiping. We know that we're worshiping the one true God. And that's great. But the point that I'm trying to make when I say that is that in this passage, they worshiped lots of gods. And Paul's in with them was to say, you have an altar to the unknown God. Well, the unknown God is the only true God, is the one true God. And one of the things that I think is prevalent today, well, a couple of things that I think are prevalent today is, first of all, we all know that there is just one God. And I think that most of us feel like we know the one true God pretty well. I would contend that there is always room for us to know more. And one of the best ways that we can do that is to have a daily Bible reading time, a Bible study that perhaps we're a part of. There's always room for you and even for me as a pastor. There's always room for us to dig deeper and to get to know God better. And so in that sense, we can better get to know who we're worshiping. The other thing that I would contend is that, and you've heard me talk about this before, but there are plenty of false gods out there. They don't go by the names of Zeus or Hermes or Aphrodite anymore, but they go by names like wealth and fame and power. And sometimes I think even our modern day Christians kind of confuse the gods that they're worshiping. Let's make sure that we are not worshiping at the altars of wealth and power and fame, that we are worshiping the one true God and the one true God only. That is the first reminder this passage has for us. The second reminder is this. As disciples, we should remember that God is never far from us. As disciples, we should remember that God is never far from us. So again, in this passage, that is exactly what it says in verse 27. It says that God is not far from any one of us. Paul was trying to make that point to the Athenians so that they would know that they didn't have to do all of these crazy things that they were doing to try to reach out to their gods, lowercase g, gods plural. And friends, I want to point out that for a lot of us, as we go through the Christian life, that there are times when undoubtedly we have those hilltop moments and we feel incredibly close to God. But at the same time, my guess is that most of the people that are watching this video have probably had experiences like I've had over the course of my life where we're down in the lowest part of the valley and we feel far from God. And to be clear, I am not saying that there is anything wrong with you if you have ever felt far from God. That is a normal emotion that most of us have experienced at some point in our lives. Maybe not all of us, but many of us, myself included, we've had moments when we have felt far from God. And what I simply want to remind you, and I think that you already know this, but it's worth repeating, is that even though you might feel far from God, even though I might feel far from God, that the truth is that God is never far from us. God is always this close to us. Even if I feel far from God, even if you feel far from God, God's never far from us. That is the second reminder this passage has for us. The third reminder is this. As disciples, we should remember that God knows us best. As disciples, we should remember that God knows us best. One of the things that Paul does at the end of this passage is he borrows from a Greek poet who said, we are God's offspring, we are God's children. And Paul continues with that thought. And Paul says, well, therefore, since I agree with your Greek poet, he says, since we are God's children, we should not think that God is like silver, gold, or stone, something that we've created. And Paul goes on to explain we need to do our best to have a right relationship with God. But the point that we need to remind ourselves of is that God is the one who knows us better than we know ourselves. When you think about all of the people who know you and think about all of the people over the course of your life that have known you the very best, who comes to mind for you? Do you think of your spouse? Do you think of your parents? My guess is that for a lot of people, maybe not everybody, but for a lot of the people that are watching this video, when you think about, the person who knew me the best was mom. Or maybe you're thinking, the person who knew me best was dad. Maybe some of you watching this, you're thinking, the person who knows me best, Pastor Kerry, is actually my best friend. Whoever that person is, it's wonderful and it's important that all of us have people like that in our lives. But we can never forget that the one who knows us the very best is our Creator, is God. I would just remind you of the opening words of the 139th Psalm. Psalm 139 says, you have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out, my lying down. You're familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, Lord, you know it completely. Talking about how well God knows us. God knows us better than anyone else, and that's a good thing. And the last thing that I would encourage you to prayerfully consider is this. In Acts 17:31, Paul warns the Athenians about the ultimate day of judgment. How do you feel when you think about the judgment day? Now, I'll give you a spoiler here. My hope is that you feel safe and you feel secure and you know that you're going to be good on the day of judgment, because we are. And if the day of judgment is something that causes you anxiety, and if you want to talk to me about that, then please reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to visit with you about that. But I thought it might be something for you to think about and to pray about this week, about how you feel when you think about Judgment Day. And friends, one of the things that we know, of course, is that the reason that we have this safe, secure relationship with God is because of what was accomplished at the cross. I would remind you